The child had no name, not in the way others did. In the ruins of the northern hamlet where he was born, the few remaining villagers whispered of him in hushed tones, calling him an ill omen, a child born during dark times when evil dominated the land. Born under a blood eclipse and swaddled in a cowl of blood-stained cloth, his mother passed soon after his birth, and his father vanished the next night. Some say the wolves took him. Others say he walked willingly into the snowdrifts, his will to live broken. Despite his brutal introduction to the world, the boy never cried. In a place already swallowed by the reach of the hellmouth of the north, where the land blistered with infernal heat one moment and bone-biting cold the next, such things were omens. There were no midwives or priests to banish thee, to see to the boy, to share with him the warmth and joy of life. Only a crumbling shrine, long since defiled, and a crone who dared not look the child in the eyes. Even at 3 winters old, the boy's dark eyes gleamed with a chilling clarity. He watched the bleak world around him not with wonder, but with something colder, a patient, calculating detachment. He was often found lingering at the edge of the slaughtering pens, transfixed as animals bled out into the snow. Only then did his blank expression shift, as though something within him stirred at the sight of red. The villagers spoke of it in whispers, how no other children would play with him, how he had harmed the baker's son without cause, how he once drove a splintered bone through a crow's eye and smiled faintly at the twitching aftermath. Always he watched. Never did he speak. And when other children were hurt in his presence, it was as though he were watching a story unfold, fascinated by its end. By the age of 6, he was feared by the other children and shunned by the elders. But the heretic priest who wandered through the ruins saw something else. They saw potential. Hell's winds carry a scent to those who know it, the villagers heard the priest say, and this boy reeks of promise. That night they returned. Any villagers who once had the will to resist had long since been fed to the sacrificial altars. Those who remained knew better than to speak. They were silent, hollow things, survivors only in the most technical sense. When the heretic priest returned for the boy, none raised a hand, none shed a tear. In truth, a quiet relief passed through the hamlet like a ghost wind. The boy had always unnerved them, and in his absence they felt no grief, only the faint hope that their nightmare had been taken back by the hell that birthed it. When they asked the boy if he would come with them, he nodded. He did not ask where, having little interested in remaining in the desolate hamlet. They marched for 3 days, until they reached a circle of black stones sunk deep in the permafrost. A portal shimmered in the air like oil on water, pulsing with the breath of the inferno. The priest placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and turned him toward the circle of black stones. Around them, a dozen cloaked figures began to chant in a tongue not of the natural world. Sulphur and myrrh smoked from braziers set at each point of the circle, and the ground trembled faintly with each syllable uttered. A carved bone dagger was drawn across the priest's palm, the blood offered to the stones. The portal flared with hellish light, and the boy did not flinch. "You, Colgift, are offered unto the circle," the priest intoned, voice rising with the wind. "May you emerge shaped or shattered." The boy said nothing. He stepped forward as the cloaked figures fell silent and raised their hands in solemn salute. Without hesitation, he entered the gate. Behind him, the portal snapped shut like a jaw. Behind him, the gate hissed shut. Somewhere beyond mortal reckoning, in a place that knew neither time nor mercy, the initiate had been welcomed into the depths of hell. The air within the seventh circle was heavy with copper and ash. The sky was a bruised wound, pulsing with unnatural light, and beneath it sprawled the barracks, a jagged fortress of scorched iron and obsidian. This would be his home. The boy stepped from the gate and was met by silence. No greetings, no instruction, only the stench of oil, brimstone, and dried blood. Iron bells rang somewhere in the distance, the sound vibrating in his bones like a low growl. Before him stretched a 1,000-foot corridor lined with cages. Some were empty, others not. In the barracks, the damned did not rest. He was given no name, no bed, only a corner to claim and a pit to sleep in if he wished. The other children, if they could still be called that, were gaunt and silent, their eyes reflecting the same coldness as his own. They did not speak to him. Instead, they studied him with the measured wariness of predators recognizing one of their own, waiting to see whether he would survive long enough to become competition, or if he was merely another offering to the furnace. Each day, he was taken by the jailers to the training pits, where he was made to stand before ghosts, damned souls of history's most infamous murderers, assassins, and torturers. These were not shades of sorrow or regret. These were instructors. One taught him the anatomy of pain, how to slice sinew without killing. Another, a butcher king from an empire long swallowed by time, showed him how to wield every weapon from bone knife to garrote. A third soul, wreathed in buzzing flies, whispered of poisons that boiled the mind or slowed the heart until sleep became a grave. Each lesson ended in practice. They gave him bodies, sometimes of animals, sometimes not. They watched him work. He was quick to learn, quicker to please. When he slept, it was in a recessed alcove etched with infernal script, beneath a wall of ancient blades offered by the condemned. When he ate, it was in the mess hall where each trainee was constantly exposed to toxins and poisons. When he spoke, it was only through the hand signs of the death commandos. The lessons in stealth began in silence and ended in blood. The instructors showed him how to melt into shadow, how to move across obsidian floors without sound, how to slow his breath until it almost completely stopped. They blindfolded him and sent him crawling through labyrinths filled with razors and bone chimes. A single sound meant failure. Failure meant punishment. He learned to read vibrations through stone, to anticipate the shift of a century's weight by the creak of leather. The damned souls taught him to wear shadows like a veil, to watch and wait and strike before his target could speak their final prayer. In the great training chambers, he stalked his fellow initiates unseen. A wraith among wraiths, he exceeded in all things. Where others hesitated, he acted. Where others mimicked cruelty to impress their instructors, he embodied it without thought. His precision with the knife surpassed that of many damned teachers, and his ingenuity with poisons left even ancient killers impressed. In one evaluation, he turned a substance meant to induce paralysis into a weapon of slow-burning madness, smiling faintly as the test subject tore at their own flesh. Many of his peers perished during the trials, devoured by hell beasts, eviscerated in duels, or broken by the lessons. But not him. The boy thrived. The deeper the lessons delved into pain, the more natural his movements became. It was not just that he survived what others could not. It was that he made it look effortless. As the years passed and the boy grew into a young man, he was deemed worthy. He was summoned at midnight, roused by a silent warden whose face was wrapped in a veil of stitched flesh. No words were spoken, none were needed. The man followed, passing through the barrack halls and descending into the depths beneath the seventh circle. There, he was brought into the arsenal, the vault of quiet deaths. Here, beneath red sigils and flickering iron braziers, lay the weapons of the death commandos. A robed smith awaited him, his eyes seared shut, his lips burned black by the smoke of Tartarus. With skeletal precision, the smith gestured to a basin carved from a single slab of obsidian. In it hissed the waters of the river Styx, thick with poison and souls too broken to scream. The claws of Tartarus were drawn from the basin, blades curved like the talons of an ancient predator, still dripping with infernal venom. Their steel was black, marbled with veins of shimmering red, and the moment he touched them, he felt the poison whisper to his blood. He was also given a silenced pistol, matte black, etched with curses in infernal script. It drank the sound of its own gunfire, erasing the moment of death from the world. Finally, a stealth generator was affixed to his back, its casing made from the ribcage of a martyr, its core, the still beating heart of an innocent. The device pulsed with infernal light, refracting him until he was more suggestion than substance, hidden from mortal eyes, and even from the gaze of heaven itself. He donned the tools in silence. When he looked into the mirror of black glass at the chamber's end, he saw only the predatory mask of his armor, faceless, fanged, and inhuman. From the shadows stepped a figure clad in robes of red iron thread, a priest of the archdevil Beleth, bearing the final rite. Without ceremony, the priest drew a ritual dagger, its edge forged from the spine of a martyr. The man knelt without instruction. No oath was spoken. There would never be words again. The blade entered his mouth, and with one swift motion, the rite was done. He made no sound, only a sharp intake of breath before silence claimed him completely. He did not fall. He did not waver. He stood. The priest bowed his head. Around them, the shadows seemed to tighten in acknowledgement. Now was complete. He emerged from hell no longer something fully of the natural world. His armor was a grotesque fusion of shell, flesh, and blasphemous artifice. Segmented bronze-like carapace covered his chest and limbs, etched with infernal sigils and burn scars from the forge of Beleth. From his back jutted needle-thin antennae and bone spears, twitching with malicious intent. His arms, once human, had been reshaped, longer, sinewed with darkened muscle and glistening tendon, ending in clawed fingers stained black-red with dried blood. His mask was a monstrous helm, shaped like the eyeless skull of a deep-sea predator, with small vents along the jawline that hissed softly with each breath. The mouth of the mask was a suggestion of teeth, jagged and overlapping, designed to inspire dread rather than practicality. Hanging from his waist were strands of rusted chainmail, tattered and soaked with remnants of past violence. To behold him was behold a predator, a thing not only forged for death, but sculpted in its image. He crossed into the mortal world under cover of twilight, slipping through ravines carved by shellfire and fields salted with charred bones. He walked hunched and fluid, moving low among the broken teeth of no man's land, bypassing minefields, wire traps, and barbed wire with ease. The stealth generator hummed faintly, just enough to distort the light around him, refracting his passage into flickers and smears. As he drew closer to the trench line, he paused only to observe. The faithful had dug deep here. Gun ports, rimmed with protective anointment, glimmered with oil like open wounds. Communication arrays sat atop angular command bunkers reinforced with sanctified steel and festooned with fluttering prayer ribbons. each one a desperate ward against what crept through the dark. Pilgrims patrolled with devotional chants, half-spoken through cracked lips. He descended like shadow. The first sentry never saw the claw that slipped under his helmet, nor did the second, who was too busy lighting a sacred taper to notice the pistol pressed against his ear. By the time the sergeant turned to bark a command, he was already behind him, silent, precise, ruthless. That night the trench fell into confusion. Radio signals went dead. Lanterns blinked out. When reinforcements arrived by dawn, they found the dugout transformed into a slaughterhouse. Corpses were arranged in mocking displays. A chaplain pinned upright with devotional candles melted into his eyes. A radio operator's severed arms folded in prayer over his own gaping chest. A line of faithful soldiers propped along the trench wall, their helmets turned inward as if still holding silent vigil. Yet it served no strategic purpose. The bunkers had not been captured. The trench had not been held. Rather than working to further Hell's legions, the night's bloodletting had merely been an indulgence for the freshly minted death commando. After long years of silent training, of obedience and discipline and control, he had been loosed. He had finally been let of the leash and allowed to slake his dark hunger. But even bloodlust has its limits. In the nights that followed, he continued the slaughter, moving from trench to outpost, from watchtower to bunker. Every strike was efficient, every kill unchallenged. But slowly, methodically, he began to slow. Not from fatigue, not from mercy, from calculation. He understood what others of his kind did not. Indulgence draws attention, and while not all attention was unwelcome, it is something that should be applied with care. He had tested his tools, proven his silence, savored the thrill. But wanton carnage was inefficient, wasteful. He began to move differently, no longer tearing through targets for the thrill, but watching, listening. He spent hours in the muck outside a command camp, mapping guard routes and timing patrols. He let opportunities pass. He let soldiers live. He waited. He knew that to continue like before would invite a response. To do too much too fast would cause the church to respond. They would send their own predators, agents of the divine with eyes that pierced shadow and blades that sang hymns. Now was the time to be still. Now was the time to hunt. He began selecting targets, signal officers, relic couriers, liaisons between trench lines. He moved without pattern, without trace. He no longer adorned every kill in spectacle, but when the opportunity struck with precision, when a body could send a message louder than a bomb, he made sure it spoke volumes. There were still corpses posed in mockery, still scenes crafted with malicious intent, but now they were reserved for moments when the psychological wound would fester the deepest. Only when the damage would be maximal did he indulge. Where once he painted his path in gore for its own sake, now he stitched it in silence, thread by calculated thread. On occasion, he worked alongside others of his kind, other death commandos. They would arrive without warning, melt into the dark beside him, and together orchestrate ruin. They spoke no words. They had no names. But in the flick of a clawed hand, in the tilt of a helm, entire plans were shared. Their hand signs were a language born of stillness and death, and through them they coordinated synchronized strikes that unraveled the wills of entire battalions. Where he was surgical, they were symphonic, a choir of killers in perfect, silent unison. Years passed. He did not count them. There was no need. War had no calendar, only rhythm. He refined his methods, drawing patterns from chaos, stitching shadows with greater care. His hands grew steadier, his judgment colder. He became less creature, more principle, an equation of death solved over and over in new forms. And the faithful began to whisper. They gave him names: the Hollow Talon, the Black Quiet, the Saint Slayer. They blamed sabotage, they blamed infiltrators, they blamed each other. But deep within the synaptic chambers of the church, among the cathedral fortresses of New Antioch and the grand chapels of the southern front, more serious eyes began to turn. Divine agents were deployed, oracles and inquisitors, castigators and watch saints. They were no less shaped by war than he was, sculpted by the fires of holy dogma, honed not by devils, but by saints and relics and righteous suffering. Where he was the blade of infernal precision, they were hammers of sacred fury. He felt their presence before he saw them, not as a light or sound, but as a shift in the theatre of war itself. The influence of hell grew dimmer where they passed. Heretical sigils smouldered and failed. The ground grew still. The troops of the faithful stood straighter, held their formations longer, fought with a conviction that bordered on divine madness. He saw it in their eyes, less fear, more fury. Resolve hardened in them like steel beneath scripture. He knew then that the hunt had changed. He was no longer simply the predator. He was now also prey, and it exhilarated him. The challenge shaped him anew. He adapted, moved quieter, cut deeper. His missions became longer, slower, more precise. He studied not only his targets, but the movements of those hunting him. He struck not where it was easiest, but where it was boldest, just out of reach, just fast enough to vanish. He played the line between silence and provocation, like a musician plucking a cursed string. And still, he did not speak. The hunt was his answer, the war, his scripture. But scripture, even dark scripture, cannot protect flesh forever. It was during a raid on a fortified relay tower that he felt it, a searing pulse along his side, the hiss of something holy burning through his outer plate. An inquisitor of the Iron Creed had anticipated him, having rigged the relay tower with explosive packed full of blessed nails. He escaped, but not untouched. The wound was shallow, but it sang. It ached in a way none of his prior injuries ever had. His blood hissed where it met the edge of the relic's residue. No poison, no toxin, only pain. He did not forget. 3 nights later, beneath a harvest moon wreathed in mortar smoke, he found the Inquisitor again. Not upon the battlefield, not astride a pulpit or surrounded by guards, but within a tent nestled deep behind the second line, a place of prayer, rest, and assumed safety. The sentries never stirred. The patrols and sentries were bypassed with practiced ease. And there, upon a bed carved of consecrated oak, the Inquisitor of the Iron Creed slumbered beneath veils of incense and scripture. He made no spectacle, no altar of mockery, no message carved into bone. He simply knelt beside the bed, placed a clawed hand over the Inquisitor's mouth, and slid the knife in. The breath ended. The pain was brief. When dawn came, the tent was intact, its furnishings untouched, save for a single, blood-darkened nail laid upon the pillow. The kill had not gone unnoticed. From the moment the Inquisitor's soul was wrenched from its mortal shell and dragged shrieking into the pit, the tremor echoed through ash-choked trenches, through the furnace wind of the Seventh Circle, and into the throne chamber of Archdevil Bele. For a time, the Commando had been just another sharpened blade in his vast arsenal. But now the blade sang. And that song had grown too sharp, too precise to be left to the chaos of trench warfare. His flawless record of slaughter had not only elevated him in the eyes of his masters, it had marked him for potential worthy of higher purpose, of grander hunts. There were whispers in Beleth's court now, of assignments beyond the shattered fronts, of targets whose deaths could fracture entire campaigns. And at the center of those whispers always was him. He was to leave the trenches, to travel west, beyond the blasted valleys and broken forests, to the rust-black coast where tides boiled with oil and salt. There, waiting for him, was a surfaced submarine, its hull pitted and ossified, marked with symbols from the abyss. It rose like a carcass left to rot in the sea, but from its armored hatches spilled life. Heretic naval raiders clad in salt-eaten armor and festooned in rusted chain and trophies of bone. Their leader stood foremost, his armor the color of drowned copper, pocked and stained with dried blood. He wielded a brutal boarding axe, slick with fresh viscera, and from his gorget hung the skulls of drowned priests. No words were exchanged, only a slow nod and the hiss of the gangplank lowering. Without hesitation, he boarded. The sea swallowed them soon after, the submarine slipping beneath the waves like a leviathan, seeking depths darker than thought. Though he would always be a monster unto himself, he found a certain kinship among the raiders. Like him, they were forged in horror, marked not by uniform, but by infamy. They were elite, favored murderers of hell's most brackish gods. Each of them had committed acts of such depravity and savagery that even the faithful used their names as warnings. They did not ask his name. They knew better than to try and converse with a tongueless assassin, but they recognized him as a fellow killer. Their submarine's hull stank of rot and oil, and the air was thick with fumes siphoned directly from the lake of fire, a burning miasma of soul ash, an infernal gas. He inhaled it without discomfort. In truth, he welcomed it. It reminded him of home. Though he was already well aware of hell's naval forces and their endless, savage competition to commit ever-escalating acts of murder and heresy in order to outdo one another and earn favor with their infernal patrons, he found himself fascinated all the same when the raiders surfaced near a drifting transport ship. It had wandered from faithful waters, lost in storm. Under the veil of midnight fog, the raiders slipped from the submarine like barnacled phantoms, scaling the transport's hull with brutal ease. He watched as they breached the deck in coordinated silence, dispatching sentries with whispered strikes, their movements precise and practiced. What followed was a massacre, efficient, joyous, ritualized. Each band of naval raiders carried their own signature, their mark, to leave behind after a successful boarding. This cruise was unmistakable. They piled the bodies of their victims, some still gasping, some already gone, into a great mound, then drove massive harpoons through the heap from all angles. The resulting abomination resembled a sea urchin, sculpted from human agony, a macabre spire of limbs and iron. He admired the work. There was poetry in it. They continued their journey through the abyssal dark. Time passed in silence, marked only by the creak of rusted bulkheads and the guttural hum of engines burning infernal fuel. The crew moved like shadows, murmuring half-heard prayers to forgotten sea demons or sharpening weapons crusted with salt and blood. One evening, if it could be called that beneath the sea's crushing black, one of the raiders approached. His helmet hung from his belt, revealing a face like old leather stretched across bone, with eyes the color of wet stone. "We're nearing the English Isles," he rasped. "Coastal town, small, quiet. dawn strike in the name of the morning star. He waited a beat, then added, "Will you silence the sentries?" It was a formality. Among the death commandos, to refuse an opportunity to ply one's art was as close to heresy as one could come. The assassin gave no reply. None was needed. He rose from where he crouched, claws flexing, eyes unreadable behind the mask. Already, in his mind, the approach had begun. Paths traced in shadow, exits marked in blood. The ritual would be done. Hours before the sun threatened the horizon, the submarine breached far north of the town, a jagged black shape sliding above the waves just long enough to disgorge its assassin. He climbed into the shallows without a sound, the surf boiling quietly around his legs. The coast was rock-strewn and cold, the scent of salt and rot thick on the wind. Behind him, the submarine lingered only a moment more before descending once again into the deep, its raiders preparing for their own grim emergence directly off the town's coast. He was alone now, just as he preferred it. The land accepted his presence without protest. The stones gave him footing, the night offered cover, and the wind, thick with brine, masked the sound of his approach. He began the crawl toward the town, each movement deliberate, every footfall a whisper. In his mind, he had already killed the watchman, already mapped the blood. Dawn would bring fire, but the first deaths would belong to him. He reached the outskirts of the town in less than an hour, slipping between hedgerows and over stone walls with ghost-like ease. The stealth generator throbbed gently on his back, refracting the moonlight and shrouding his form in a warping shadow. In the dark, he was nearly invisible, more an absence than a presence, a distortion against the shape of the world. He paused atop a grassy ridge overlooking the coastal hamlet. Oil lamps glimmered faintly from windows and watchtowers. A bell swung gently in the breeze from a steeple at the town centre, but no alarm was sounded. The sentries would not see what came for them. Far behind, the sea was silent. The submarine had vanished beneath the waves once more, moving to position. When it returned, it would do so directly offshore, emerging not as a vessel of war, but as a herald of doom. But before the horns could sound, before the blood could run in earnest, the sentries had to fall. And that was his task. He crouched in stillness upon the ridge, letting his eyes sweep across the sleeping town. Every alley, every rooftop, every glint of lantern light was catalogued. His mind passed the town like a butcher charts flesh, locating arteries, seams, and soft points. He marked the position of each watchtower, counting the steps of every patrol, noting the length of their routes and where their vision overlapped. He watched the way the wind stirred the fog down alleyways, how the lamplight flickered across cobblestone. Within minutes, the town was no longer a mystery. It was a map of opportunity. He moved like a rumor on the wind, silent, intangible, lethal. One by one, he tracked the patrolling sentries, following them from rooftops and alley shadows, always waiting for that brief moment of isolation. When they stepped beyond the sight lines of their fellows, he struck. A whisper of motion, the faintest cough of his silenced pistol, and they fell, each one crumpling without sound, faces frozen mid-yawn. With the outer patrols gone, he turned his attention to the towers. He scaled their beams like a spider in the rafters, slipping through wooden slats and chimney shadows until he loomed behind each weary watchman. Then came the claws, quick, clean, and intimate. No screams, only a wet gasp and the twitch of limbs as they collapsed. By the time dawn's first ember broke the horizon, The final sentry gurgled his last. The assassin crouched atop the bell tower, claws slick, breath steady. Far below, the sea began to churn. The raiders were coming. He watched from his perch as silhouettes began to rise from the waves, silent and deliberate, bulky figures armored in barnacled plating and dripping with seawater. The heretic naval raiders advanced through the surf like revenants dredged up from the ocean's grave. Their bastardized diving suits clanked and hissed with each movement, venting foul fumes into the morning mist. Each one bore weapons of intimate violence, belt-fed machine guns rattling with rust, short, straight blades honed for boarding work, and savage one-handed axes. As they fully emerged from the shallows, their formation fanned out across the beach, only to pause. A fresh patrol had wandered onto the sand, bleary-eyed, just waking, rifles slung carelessly, mouths half open in confused greeting. The moment shattered in a heartbeat. The raiders opened fire. The dawn was drowned in the roar of automatic fire. The sand churned into mist and blood. The patrol never even raised their weapons. The assassin watched, motionless, as the first cries of alarm began to ripple through the town below. Shutters banged open. Bells began to toll. The first echoing calls for help cracked against the still dim sky. In response, the raiders moved with practiced haste. From their belts and bandoliers, they unclipped rusted canisters, relics of hell's own chemical arsenals. With a twist and a hiss, the first of them were lobbed into the town like offerings. They arced over rooftops, trailing lines of green-black vapor in their wake. The canisters clattered into courtyards, alleyways, and through open windows. Moments later, they hissed and spat, releasing clouds of noxious gas that rolled low and thick through the narrow streets. The assassin could hear the coughing begin, the panicked screams. The gas was designed not to kill immediately, but to choke, blind, and break resolve, to turn defenders into disoriented prey. And into that fog, the raiders surged. Despite the bulk of their suits, they moved with frightening speed, propelled by the infernal fumes that hissed through their rebreathers and pulsed in their veins. The toxins drawn from the lake of fire did more than sustain them. They transformed them, sent them into berserker frenzy. They emptied their magazines with savage abandon, mowing down anything that moved. When their rounds were spent, they did not hesitate, drawing blades and boarding axes with a howl that rose from the vents in their helmets. The town quickly descended into carnage. Faithful soldiers, choking and half-blind, scrambled to form a defense, only to be hacked apart before their formations could cohere. Makeshift barricades were overrun in seconds. Blades tore through flesh, and axes cracked through armor and bone. Every alley became a killing floor, every courtyard a charnel house. The raiders advanced like a tide of rot and ruin, unstoppable and ecstatic in their fury. Out in the bay, the submarine breached once more, its barnacled hull rising with a mournful groan. Upon its slick deck stood new figures, twisted silhouettes draped in algae-slicked robes, their flesh mottled and puckered like drowned corpses. Sea hags. These were not witches of flame or storm, but artillery witches bred for the navy of hell, their magic steeped in tide blood and shipwreck offerings. They raised their bloated arms and began their grim work, hurling shells of flesh-wrapped iron high into the air. The rounds screamed as they flew, detonating across the town in wet explosions that tore through homes and ignited fires in the streets. Others knelt at the edge of the deck, chanting in guttural, salt-choked tongues. From beneath the waves came torpedoes, not machines, but conjured beasts wrapped in rust and bone, shrieking through the water toward the docks. The few vessels moored there never stood a chance. They were torn apart in gouts of fire and brine, splinters and bodies tossed skyward as the harbour was consumed. Yet the servants of the tyrant god were not so easily broken. For all the carnage, all the sudden slaughter, there remained men of faith deeper within the town, soldiers who had heard the tolling of bells and did not panic, who had been drilled to respond with fire and fortitude. They rallied behind barricades, their leaders barking scripture-laced commands as they hauled heavier weapons into place. Their oaths did not falter, their hands did not shake. Return fire began to answer the raiders' onslaught. Muzzle flashes bloomed from upper windows and reinforced alleys, and the dull thumps of mounted heavy weapons rang out across the square. High-caliber rounds tore through the mist and smoke, ripping into even the thick plating of the raiders' armor. Bodies fell, some torn in half by concentrated volleys. The berserkers stumbled but did not retreat. Many fell mid-charge, still screaming psalms to their infernal patrons, even as their lifeblood painted the cobbles. But for all their fury, the raiders were few in number, and the initial ambush had come at a cost. Lacking proper support, they had gambled everything on shock and savagery. Now, with the element of surprise fading, the town's defenders began to isolate them, cutting off angles of retreat, pinching their lines with coordinated flanks. Mortar fire began to rain from the hills beyond the town, forcing the raiders to break formation. One shell landed dangerously close to the breached submarine, sending waves through the water of the bay. Another burst in mid-air, showering the deck in shrapnel. One of the sea hags shrieked, a gurgling, unnatural sound, as her chest was torn open by a hail of iron fragments. She collapsed into a heap of robes and brine, her spells dissipating like mist under sunlight. The battle had shifted. The faithful were not just holding, they were pushing back. From the bell tower's shadow, the death commando began his descent. He slipped through the smoke-cloaked streets with fluid silence, his stealth generator blurring him into little more than a ripple in the chaos. He did not pause to aid the faltering raiders. Their fate, while regrettable, was not his concern. He had not come to the Isles to win battles. He had come to hunt. Still, as a parting gift to his kinsman, he offered a gesture of grim precision. He found the priest easily. The man stood atop a shattered cart, robes flaring as he cried aloud, rallying the defenders with scripture and fury. Around him, the lines steadied, the resolve deepened. The assassin emerged from the haze like a ghost, stepping from the fog behind the priest. The Tartarus claws whispered as they carved a clean red smile across the preacher's throat. The priest gurgled mid-sermon and collapsed. By the time the faithful turned, the killer was already gone. He melted back into the chaos and slipped through the shattered edge of the town, vanishing into the countryside. Behind him, the tide turned again. The submarine began to descend, its hull groaning as it slid back beneath the waves. The remaining raiders, bloodied and scattered, fought toward the surf, cutting down those who barred their retreat, leaving their wounded behind. He moved like smoke through hedgerow and ruin, leaving the burning town behind him. The chaos, the blood, the screeching steel. It faded into memory, a curtain drawn behind him. The countryside stretched quiet before him. Charred farmsteads, ditches swollen with rain and rot, groves twisted by shell shock. It was a land broken not by a single battle, but by 1,000 little wars. He walked alone, but he was not without direction. Whispers had guided him, Visions etched into his thoughts like brands, gifted by the demons that ruled his fate. The voices of his overlords did not come with words, but with urges, impulses, glimpses of futures not yet written but already bleeding. He followed the path set by those whispers. His destination was a sanatorium. Hidden beyond the mist and fences, nestled somewhere in the hills of the Isles, it was a place the Synod believed forgotten. A place of recovery for war-touched minds and broken bodies. But the whispers told him there was more. Within its walls was a boy, a child not yet marked by the rites of the Church, but whose soul burned with a dangerous clarity. The kind that the agents of the Synod would one day discover. A tactical savant, a prophet of the tyrant God. One who could hear the divine voice not in part, but in full. He could not be allowed to live. The hunt had begun anew. He moved deeper into the heartland of the faithful, skirting hamlets and convoys, passing through fields of prayer-sown wheat and past shrines riddled with gunfire. He became part of the countryside, never seen, never sensed, only imagined as a chill down the spine or a shadow where none should be. He avoided towns where sermons blared from chapel spires and flagellants beat the roads bloody. He bypassed rail lines where troop transports chugged north toward the front. He needed no maps, no guides. The whispers led him, as they always had, and after days of tireless stalking, he found it. A narrow valley opened before him, veiled in morning mist and framed by crooked oaks. Nestled within it, perched between crag and forest, stood the sanatorium, a great grey thing of mortar and stone, crowned with spires and latticed windows. It loomed like a mausoleum disguised as a place of healing. Wards had been built like wings, long and low, and chimneys issued pale trails of smoke that faded into the clouds. He watched from the ridgeline, unblinking. The boy was in there. He watched from afar, unseen upon the ridge, as the nuns moved through the courtyard and corridors, tending to patients, cleaning walkways, lighting devotional candles. Their pace was serene, their voices hushed in gentle prayer. None of them noticed the predator in the hills, cloaked in shadow and refracted light, drinking in every detail of their routine. When night fell, the sky cloaked in cloud, and the sanatorium dimmed to silence, he rose from his hiding place. The wind rustled through the trees above him, but he made no sound. It was time to make the kill. The sanatorium, so far removed from the front lines, offered little in the way of true defense. The few guards that patrolled its grounds were old men in borrowed uniforms, more ceremonial than capable. The nuns who managed the halls were unaware, moving with the practiced rhythm of care and prayer. He approached unseen. The stealth generator cloaked his presence, rendering him a blur within the drifting fog. He slithered through hedges and crept along the walls, bypassing lantern light and skipping from shadow to shadow. Inside, candles flickered behind stained glass windows. Hymns drifted softly through the cold night air. Somewhere, a nurse hummed a lullaby to calm a restless patient. He did not harm them. This was not mercy. This was purpose. The boy had to die, and to raise an alarm through unnecessary slaughter would jeopardize everything. His task was too important. So he moved with restraint, bypassing the waking few with inhuman patience, stalking toward the wing, where the whispers told him his prey lay dreaming. As he crept through the halls, the air thick with antiseptic and incense, he passed rows of heavy doors bolted shut. Behind them, madmen raved, voices howling with war-born hysteria and visions conjured from hell's own depths. Some were soldiers broken by years on the front, hollow-eyed, twitching, reliving battles that had never ended in their minds. Others had never seen a trench. They were not shattered by shellfire, but by the voice of their God, the divine whisper that called from pulpits and relics, threading into their minds until clarity unraveled. Some wept, some laughed. Others rocked endlessly in dark corners, clutching symbols carved into their flesh. And some were simply insane. The assassin paid them no mind. Their pain was a byproduct of a faith to a false god, and they were no threat to his task. He moved on, ever toward the boy. The whispers had led him without fail for years. They had never lied. Until now. He reached the cell in silence, waiting until the last of the nuns on nightly rounds drifted past. Her sandals echoed faintly down the corridor, and as her light disappeared around the bend, he slipped forward. The door had been left unlocked. Too confident, too far from the front. He eased it open, ready to find his target. A pale figure bound to a bed, a child in a straitjacket, helpless and dreaming of things he should not know. But the room was empty. No patient, no bindings. Only the cold cot, the distant hiss of wind through the lattice window, and a devotional candle burning too low to chase the shadows. He stood still, confusion blooming where certainty should have been. The whispers had lied. No, not lied. Misled, deceived. And that was a far more dangerous thing. He turned to flee, to abandon the hunt and retreat into the night, to seek the cause, to find the thread that had been pulled from the weave of his mission. But as he stepped back into the hallway, something blocked his path. A figure. It stood motionless, clad in rust-streaked armor shaped like a knight of ancient age, its form broad and monolithic, its limbs encased in dented plate and thick mesh. A red shield marked with faded sigils hung from its shoulder, and from its gauntleted grip dangled a cruel spear tipped with a tri-bladed barb. The assassin's stealth generator flickered, not with failure, but with realization. The figure could see him. Its head resembled a turret, a single black lens in the center of a featureless dome. There was no mouth, no face, no human element. But still, the killer felt it. The stare. And in the silence, a name hissed in his mind, not from outside, but from some deep recess of memory or damnation. Observer. The figure took a single step forward. The commando did not move. The observer needed no blade drawn to be a threat. He walked slowly, with the weight of absolute certainty, the lens never leaving the blur of the commando's cloaked form. The shadows had betrayed him. The mission was compromised. And he knew, without question, that he had been hunted. Fast as a whip, he raised his silenced pistol and snapped off a volley at the observer. The first shot missed entirely. The next two deflected harmlessly off the rusted plates of the figure's armor, leaving only shallow sparks in their wake. The observer moved with a speed that defied logic, jinking and twisting mid-stride as it surged forward. The assassin barely registered the blur of the trident-shaped spear before it struck his wrist. The pistol flew from his hand, skittering down the hall. With a hiss, he lunged, claws sweeping in vicious arcs, trained for killing, perfected over years of slaughter. But the observer danced between the strikes like water through a sieve. Then came the grip. A hand, large, metal, absolute, closed around his throat and lifted him effortlessly. In the same motion, the observer twisted, flipping him overhead and slamming him bodily to the floor. The hallway swam. His thoughts surged, then cleared just in time to see the spear tip descend, rushing for his eye like a divine judgment. But he, Two had long since shed mortal restraint. With a twist of his torso and a flash of inhuman reflex, he evaded the strike by a hair's breadth and rolled beneath it. In the same fluid motion, he unclipped a gas grenade from his belt and slammed the activator against the wall. It hissed. Smoke exploded through the corridor, thick, cloying and sulphurous, the kind that burned lungs and made eyes water. He moved like an animal, more instinct than man, twisting low and sprinting down the hall on all fours, cloak flaring behind him. He could not see the observer, but he felt its gaze. It would not be slowed. He had to move faster. He raced past cell doors, past moaning patients clawing at their window slits. His path brought him to the security room, a tiny post manned by a single dozing guard. The man barely had time to gasp. Claws ripped through flesh, tore bone from neck. The assassin didn't even slow. He slammed a blood-slicked hand against the control lever. Across the sanatorium, the locks disengaged. Doors opened, one by one by one. What followed was not escape. It was transformation. The sanatorium descended into a chorus of screaming. With each cell door that swung open, madness spilled into the corridors. Patients, shell-shocked soldiers, raving prophets, and the divinely afflicted staggered into the halls. Some wept, some howled. Others began to laugh high and shrill until their voices cracked. It was a waterfall effect. One scream begat another. One fit of madness infected the next. The frenzy spread like fire across parchment, and the air filled with a cacophony of shouts, sobs, chants, and guttural hymns. The restrained tore at themselves, breaking free from straitjackets with raw, bleeding hands, smashing their heads against stone until the bindings gave. Others slammed into the guards, clawing, biting, and overwhelming them by sheer numbers and unreasoning rage. Blood smeared across walls, bones shattered against iron banisters. Some of the freed patients knelt and began scratching symbols into the stone with fingernails or scraps of metal, desperate to document the visions screaming through their minds. Others clawed at their eyes or danced in the blood pooling at their feet. The nuns fled or fell. The few guards that remained either died at the hands of the inmates or sealed themselves behind locked doors, praying the walls would hold. And through it all, the assassin stood still, drinking in the chaos like a baptism. He had altered the terrain. No longer the sterile halls of healing and scripture. Now it was a hunting ground thick with confusion and screaming, an arena worthy of the final clash. He turned back into the smoke-filled corridor, claws drawn, his breath steady. The observer would return, and this time the environment would be more to his liking. He spotted the armored figure moments later, moving with uncanny grace through the chaos. The observer weaved past shrieking inmates and clawing hands with inhuman fluidity, never slowing, never faltering. The assassin did not hesitate. He dropped his stealth. There was no point now. With a hiss of breath, he lunged, racing down the corridor, Tartarus claws gleaming. The observer's spear thrust forward in a blur, but the assassin twisted mid-stride, slipping beneath it. His claws flashed out in retaliation, slashes and stabs designed to maim, to disembowel, to kill. Most strikes missed or glanced from armor. The observer moved like a spirit wrapped in steel, blocking and dodging with impossible precision. But one strike slipped through, a narrow opening at the shoulder joint. The claw bit deep. Dark blood sprayed. The assassin barely had time to register the hit before a steel-clad boot drove into his chest, sending him hurtling backward through the air. He slammed into a stone pillar and crumpled. Pain flared through his ribs. The observer surged forward to finish the fight, but the madmen in the hallway had other ideas. Drawn by the violence, by the scent of divine and infernal blood mingled in the air, they crowded the corridor. Dozens of them, raving, flailing, unaware of friend or foe, pushed between the two killers. The observer slowed. For the first time, the assassin sensed it. Frustration. But the assassin had no such hesitation. While the observer seemed unwilling to strike the deranged wretches, the assassin moved without pause. He seized one inmate, a gaunt figure raving in tongues, and hurled him like a sack of meat into the path of the advancing observer. The armored figure swayed, catching the flailing patient with an armored elbow, and in that instant, the assassin surged forward again. Another flurry, claws slashing and stabbing with renewed fury. Most were deflected or avoided, the observer moving with clockwork precision. But again, the killer's persistence paid off. A final strike slipped between the armored plates at the thigh, biting deep. More blood. In return, the observer lashed out with the shaft of his spear, smashing it into the assassin's chest. He was flung back once more, skidding across the blood-slick floor. But this time, as the observer stepped forward, inmates swarmed again, drawn by violence, by visions, by madness. Their shrieking bodies formed a living barrier. The assassin saw the subtle shift in the observer's posture, the tightening grip on the spear, the twitch of restraint. He wasted no time. Reaching again into the tide of madmen, he flung another frothing figure into the observer's path, this time using the brief distraction to rush low and fast. The observer's spear flicked out again, faster than thought, but the assassin ducked beneath it, claws flashing. This time, one struck true again, sliding into the soft seam beneath the arm. The blood came in a hot spurt. The observer reeled back a half step, not wounded deeply, but forced to adjust. Another patient threw themselves into the fray, babbling nonsense and clawing at both killers. The assassin slipped behind him, using the human shield to block the spear's return stroke. It worked. The observer's blow halted, hesitant. That hesitation cost him ground. The assassin fell back, panting, the shadows clinging to him like armor. In the distance, alarms still wailed, fires still cracked. But here in the hallway, between blood and breath, the advantage had shifted. The observer was slower now. Every movement betrayed damage, each pivot a little less sharp, each sidestep just slightly behind the tempo. Blood oozed from the seams in his armor, staining the flagstones with dark, glistening streaks. The spear was still firm in his grip, but its arc had dulled. The relentless fluidity had become a mechanical rhythm. A clock wound one too many times. The assassin circled him. He moved in tight arcs, low and predatory, eyes scanning for another opening. There was blood on his claws, not all of it the observer's. The chaos of the asylum still raged around them, shrieks echoing through the halls, lights flickering under the weight of violence. But to them, the world had narrowed to a corridor of death. He prepared to strike again. Then he stopped. Out of the corner of his eye, something caught his attention. A flicker, a presence, a figure. Small, still, a boy. He stood down a side hall, untouched by the storm of madness. Pale, barefoot, clad in the pale linens of a patient. His hands were folded, his gaze unblinking. And in that moment, the assassin knew with absolute certainty. This was his target. The boy. The reason for his hunt. The echo in the whispers. The firebrand the tyrant god would forge into a weapon. The assassin turned without hesitation, leaving the wounded observer among the lunatics. The boy didn't flee. Not yet. He simply turned and vanished into the corridor. The chase began. The assassin sprinted after him, claws scraping along the walls for balance as he ducked through broken door frames and over upturned beds. The sanatorium became a maze of screams and shifting shadows, but the boy was always ahead, turning down a hallway just as he came into view, slipping through half-closed doors, vanishing behind fluttering curtains. The assassin moved with all the speed hell had burned into him. His stealth generator pulsed erratically, fried from the earlier chaos, but it didn't matter. He didn't need stealth now. He needed to finish it. 1 minute passed, then another. He crashed through a nursery ward, then a chapel with shattered pews. The boy's shape flickered like a ghost, always one step beyond, leading him, pulling him, and then an archway, a courtyard beyond. He slowed. Moonlight poured down from above, pale and cold. Ivy clung to the high walls. Benches were overturned. A single tree stood at the center, gnarled and leafless, roots breaking the flagstones. The boy stood at its base, waiting. The assassin's breath was ragged. Blood still leaked from beneath his armor, but his claws were steady. He took a step forward. The boy turned and smiled. Not a smile of fear, but of satisfaction. The assassin froze. Something primal stirred in his chest. An instinct honed through endless battles, through ambushes and reversals. Too late. A sudden force struck him from behind. The tip of the observer's spear burst from his chest, piercing armor, muscle, and lung in one brutal thrust. His body arched, eyes wide behind the mask. The claws dropped from his hands. He spun half around, stumbling backward as the spear was ripped free in a spray of black-red blood. He staggered. The world tilted. And then he understood. The chase hadn't been a desperate flight. It had been a game, a lead, alluring. The boy had played him. Every twist through the halls, every corner turned just ahead, every narrowing corridor. It had all been deliberate, not fear, design. A child's grin masking a killer's plan. The boy had known, and he had led him into the kill zone. Somewhere beyond the ringing in his ears, he heard the slow, limping steps of the observer as he entered the courtyard. His wounds were many, his body battered, but he had followed. And the boy stood unafraid. The assassin collapsed to one knee. Blood pooled beneath him. His vision dimmed at the edges, swimming. The observer stepped forward, looming now. He reached out with one armored hand, not to strike, but to take the boy's. The child offered it without hesitation, and together they turned and walked away. The assassin tried to rise, one last motion, one last strike, but his arms would not obey. The courtyard blurred, the sky above flickering like a dying flame. He had failed, but even in death he watched, until the dark took him.